Hey everyone, welcome back to Everyday with Jesus. We are on day 47, and today our passage deals with the story of Jesus calming the sea. And this comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. So just a few verses there. The question that we're dealing with today is, how do we learn to trust God in difficult circumstances? And why does God allow difficult circumstances to come into our life? That is, why does He test our faith sometimes? And so, my encouragement is to go ahead and read through that passage. And when you've gotten past it, come back to us and we'll look at it verse by verse. It's Luke again, chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. So we see here in this passage that a storm has come upon the disciples at sea. Jesus is sleeping in the boat, and they wake him up and they say, Master, Master, we are perishing. And so he arises, calms the wind, calms the waves, and he asks them a very interesting question here in verse 25. He says, Where is your faith? What's interesting about this passage is I think for many of us, we really sympathize with the disciples. And that is, you might feel like today that you are at a place in your life where you're just in the midst of the storm. And you're like, I'm perishing. Like, Jesus, aren't you going to do anything? In fact, you look at Mark's gospel and they actually say, Do you not care that we are perishing? And so, how do we, in the midst of difficult circumstances, how do we, in the midst of the storms in our lives, learn to trust God and understand what God's purpose is? Well, we look at verse 22, and starting there in this story, it says, One day he got into the boat with his disciples, and he said to them, Let us go across to the other side of the lake. And so they set out. And so part of the reason that we would say that Jesus might be critiquing his disciples' faith is Jesus had told them where they were going. He said, let's go across to the other side of the lake. And so certainly, I think in the mind of Jesus, they should have had the faith that if Jesus was directing them there, then he was going to see them through to the other side, that he was going to fulfill this journey. And so part of trusting God through the storm is that we're trusting that God will fulfill his purpose for us. And ultimately, wherever God has called you at this stage in your life, he has a plan and a purpose for you there. He has a reason that he's called you there. But also, whatever that destination is, we just have to believe that God is going to bring us where he wants us to be in his own way and in his own time. Now, why do we believe this? Do we believe that God, for example, directs the individual affairs of the lives of his people? Many times we look at promises like Jeremiah 29:11, and where God is speaking and he says, I know the plans that I have for you. And a lot of people would say, well, yeah, but he's speaking to Israel, to the nation at large. Do we really believe that God has an individual plan for me? Well, there are a lot of verses in the Bible that actually say yes, he does. We know, for example, in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it says, it tells us individually to trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. And so the idea is that as I'm trusting God, God is directing my path. And we also believe, based on what the Bible teaches, that God is always directing my path for my good. If I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, if I'm a child of God, God is always directing my path in the way that is right for me. Romans 8:28, says that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. And so God is always working for your benefit. If you are his child, he's always working in a way that benefits you. So we just have to trust that where God is leading us, that he is going to take care of us along the way. There's an expression that says, the will of God will never lead you where the grace of God will not sustain you. But a verse I like is found in Psalm 139. And David is talking about how God knows everything about his life and about how God is directing his path. And he says in verse 3, Psalm 139. I'll just start at the beginning. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." And then he says, and this is one of I say a lot of verses are one of my favorite verses in the Bible, but this really is Psalm 139, verse 5. It says, "You hem me in before and behind and lay your hand upon me." And so he's like, you're guarding me from the front, you're guarding me from the back, and you're putting your hand there on top of me. And so to say that you are protecting me all the way around. And so we just, first of all, when we're in the midst of the storm, we're in the midst of the difficult circumstances in our life, we have to first trust that God will fulfill his purpose. So we're trusting in the purpose of God. But also, we need to be trusting in the presence of God. One of the reasons that the disciples may have had so much doubt is because in their mind, Jesus is asleep. And so we say that. Verse 23, "And as they sailed, he fell asleep." And sometimes it can feel that way in our relationship with God, that we feel like we're praying and it doesn't seem like God's doing anything. It doesn't seem like he's answering us. But his word said that he would never leave us, nor would he forsake us. And so sometimes it seems like even though we believe that God is there, that he's just being inactive. And the reality is Jesus, even though he's asleep on the boat, he hasn't left the disciples. He's resting. Ultimately, he's resting because he's confident in God. He doesn't have it. He's not worried about it. Did Jesus know the storm was coming? I think absolutely Jesus knew the storm was coming. He just wasn't worried about the storm because he knew that God was in control of it. And so Psalm 121 is another one of these great psalms, and it talks about how God is our keeper. He says, "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is the shade on your right hand. The Lord will watch over. He will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." And so the Bible tells us that the Lord is an ever-present help in times of need. And of course, Jesus says in the Great Commission, when we are going into the world, he says that I am with you always. In the book of Hebrews, we're reminded that God has said, "I will never leave you and neither will I forsake you." So we need to trust, of course, in God's purpose, and we also need to trust in his presence, that as long as I'm seeking God and serving him, that he's always going to be there. Now, of course, Jesus reminds us that we should always be praying, we should always be asking God, we should always be conversing with God and asking him to fulfill our needs. But the reality is we should never think that God is unaware of our situation or what's going on with us, or that he just doesn't care about it. And so Jesus isn't sleeping because he doesn't care about the disciples. It's because he trusts firmly in God. And he knows that God is in control of this whole situation. And so finally it says, verse 24, it says, "And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing." Now, I would say on a positive side, whenever we're concerned, whenever we have anxiety, the Bible tells us that we should cast all of our burdens on the Lord. But in part, there is this sense that the disciples have forgotten who Jesus is. They're calling him Master. But do they really believe that God is going to drown his own son? Do they really believe that if God has sent Jesus Christ to be the Messiah for the entire world, and that Jesus has called them to be disciples, that here they're just going to drown out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee? When we think about it in that way, it sounds utterly ridiculous. But again, in some sense, in the moment, in the urgency of the moment, they have forgotten who Jesus is. And so, again, in the storms in our life, we need to trust in the purpose of God. We need to trust in the presence of God. And we need to trust in the person of God. And so the reality is that when we begin to get distracted from our relationship with God, when we forget to say, "Oh, you know what? God has adopted me as his child, and he is my father, and he loves me. And we begin to forget who God is and the love that God has for us and the purpose and desire he has for us. We forget who he is, we forget whose we are. And so this distracts us from our mission, and it causes us to question God and question his plan and purpose for us. And so we trust in his purpose, we trust in his presence, we trust in his person. And so Jesus answers them in verse 25, and he said to them, "Where is your faith?" I think that's a great way of asking the question, because I think that question could be asked of us a lot of times too. Where is our faith? What are we putting our faith in? For the disciples, is their faith in the boat? Is it in the oars? Is it in their ability as fishermen? Where does their faith lie? Does their faith lie in Jesus? And for many of us, my wife reminded me, just as we were talking about this passage today, about Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And so we have the conviction of what we can't see. And so is my faith today, and is your faith today, in what I'm reading on social media, what I'm hearing in the news? Is my faith today in a particular doctor or a particular politician? Is my faith in a mask? And I'm not saying that just because we're talking to everything's going on with COVID right now, but where does my confidence in my Christian faith really lie? Do I really believe that God has a plan and a purpose for everything that's going on in my life? Am I more inclined to just trust in myself? Am I more inclined just to trust in God? Am I more inclined to put my confidence in the things that I can see and the things that are going on around me? Or am I more inclined to say, you know what, there are things that are unseen. I know that my God will not fail me, and I know that he has a purpose for me in all of this. And so finally, we see a fourth area where we need to trust God. We need to trust him in his purpose. We need to trust his presence. We need to trust his person. And we need to trust his power. It says that he awoke, he rebuked the wind, the raging waves. They ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled and said to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him?" That ultimately, and what's interesting about this, actually, to cut my own stuff off, is that the winds and waves were always obeying God. They were obeying him in the storm, and they're obeying him in the calm. And so God had a purpose even for the storm. And so some people have said, and I think this is a good way to look at it, is that faith is not just believing that God can, it's knowing that he will. And so we trust that God in every circumstance still is in control of the situation. He still has power over the situation. So if Jesus was in control of the wind and the waves, and the wind and the waves were obeying God even before he calmed the storm, then why did God send the storm at all? Why did he permit the disciples to have to go through this test of their faith? Well, ultimately, this test of their faith showed them more about who Jesus was. They had seen Jesus heal blind people and make the lame to talk, and they had seen Jesus even raise the dead. But the idea that the very elements of weather were under his control, that was something they hadn't seen before. And so many times God brings us through these things so we can see how powerfully that he can work in difficult situations, and it makes us want to worship him even more. And probably there's a lot of you watching that God brought you through a hard time. I know for me and my wife, when our daughter was struggling with cancer, and God bringing us through that when we had no other way, we could not have made it on our own. God bringing us through that and saying, wow, isn't God good? Isn't he loving? Isn't he powerful? And so when we see that, we're able to glorify him more, but we're also able to trust him more, because next time the challenge is going to be even greater. Next time, and so we have here Jesus on the boat, and there's a mighty storm coming. There's winds and waves coming. They don't know what to do. Next time, we're going to find Jesus isn't going to be on the boat at all. And so it's going to say, well, here is an even more difficult situation. God taught you to trust him last time. Will you trust him this time too? God bless you guys. Live for Jesus. We'll see you tomorrow.